Despite the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime throughout the course of World War II, this period brought about the design and creation of vehicles the likes of which the world had never seen before. Unfortunately, nearly all of these engineering feats have been lost to history. This video will showcase what I consider to be the top 10 Nazi vehicles that have survived the war and exist to this very day. Considered by many to be the most powerful tank of World War II, the Tiger II was a result of Hitler's desire for everything big. The tank was amongst the most armored of its time, being able to withstand a frontal impact from almost all Allied shells. Weighing in at a hefty 68 tons, the greatest threat to this tank was its own transmission, which was unable to cope with the stress of moving such a heavy vehicle. Subsequently, many of these tanks were abandoned and destroyed by the Germans to prevent capture. Today, less than 10 Tiger IIs exist in various states of disrepair, with at least one still running. These extremely fast and nimble motor torpedo boats were responsible for the loss of numerous Allied vessels, usually via coordinated attacks with U-boats. Over 200 of these vessels were produced, with about half surviving the war. Unfortunately, most surviving boats were later scrapped or sunk after the end of the war, and today we are left with a single surviving E-boat, the S-130. And this particular boat actually has a really interesting history behind it. In March of 1944, while on patrol, she found and attacked an American task force participating in Operation Tiger, which was a training exercise for the D-Day landings. This attack devastated the American force with a total loss of over 700 lives, and the S-130 definitely contributed to this. After the war, she was captured by the British and used for a few intelligence missions, but eventually returned to Germany and served until 1991 before being decommissioned. Currently, it's being restored to its original World War II specs. The Jagdtiger was a tank destroyer produced by mounting Germany's massive 128mm anti-aircraft gun on the Tiger II chassis. While it had superb armor and a gun able to punch through any Allied tank, it was ultimately a failure. With a weight of over 75 tons, this was the heaviest tank to see combat during World War II, resulting in many suffering the same fate as many Tiger IIs, as they were scuttled by the Germans after running out of gas or due to mechanical failure. With less than 90 ever produced, only 3 exist today. The Sturm Tiger is a unique assault gun variant of the Tiger I, intended to be used as a heavy infantry support vehicle capable of demolishing even the most heavily fortified structures. This was made possible by the massive 388mm barrel, which fired an 800-pound rocket-propelled projectile capable of immense destruction. With only 18 produced, this is truly one of the rarest and most unique tanks of the war. Thankfully, 2 Sturm Tigers still exist. The Waffenträger, or in English weapons carrier, was a product of Germany's desire for a relatively inexpensive chassis which would be capable of carrying various different cannons to be used as a tank destroyer. The design was unique from most other German tank destroyers in that it was to have a turret capable of rotating a full 360 degrees. The only completed vehicles meeting these conditions were the Kruppstreier, Ardelt, and Rheinmetall Borsig prototypes. The three prototypes were completed throughout 1944, but at this point, with the Allies closing in, Germany did not have the resources to put any of these designs into mass production. The Ardelt prototype was captured by the Soviets at the close of the war, while the fate of the other two designs are unknown. The captured Waffenträger currently resides in the Kubinka Tank Museum. The Dornier Do 335 was a heavy fighter designed in the closing years of World War II as part of Germany's emergency fighter program. The design was a radical departure from the norm due to the dual-mounted engines down the center of the aircraft. The two propellers were each mated to a massive 1,400 horsepower V12 engine, which allowed this aircraft to reach a top speed of 477 miles per hour in level flight, which made this Germany's fastest piston-driven aircraft of the Second World War. Fewer than 40 of these aircraft were built, with only one surviving to this day. This particular Do 335 A0 variant was captured by the U.S. in the final days of the war, and after testing, left to deteriorate until the mid-1970s, at which point it was shipped back to Germany to be restored by the very employees of Dornier who had originally constructed the aircraft. The restored plane now resides in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. The Sturm Tiger was an experimental SPG armed with the powerful Rheinmetall 12.8 cm K40 cannon. Two prototypes were made, with both deployed to the Eastern Front to combat Soviet forces. Despite proving effective in combat, with one of the tanks believed to have been responsible for over 30 Soviet kills, the Sturm Tiger never made it into mass production. Of the two produced, one was destroyed and the other was captured by Soviets during the siege of Stalingrad in 1943. Today, this tank resides in the Kubinka Tank Museum. Essentially, the Karl Gerät was a Sturm Tiger on steroids. The self-propelled artillery piece was massive, not only in weight, but by its enormous 600mm, and in later versions 540mm, barrel, one of the largest ever produced. Its projectiles continue the trend of massive proportions, weighing in at over 2,000 kilograms each, or about the weight of a Soviet Gaz anti-air truck. This vehicle was nearly immobile, with a top speed of only 10 kilometers per hour, meaning that it would have to be transported by train in a hugely complicated process before it could be used. Once in position, many troops would be required to protect the Karl Gerät, as it was otherwise a sitting duck if ever encountered by the enemy. Although the damage this gun was capable of inflicting is undeniable, the enormous logistics required just to operate it did not make it an effective weapon. Only 7 were produced, which each given a unique name. In 1945, the United States captured 2 of these guns, Eva and Loki, but later scrapped them both. In 1945, soon afterwards, Soviet forces captured the Zui, which can today be seen at the Kubinka Tank Museum. The fates of the remaining 4 guns are uncertain. During the initial stages of World War II, German U-boats wreaked havoc amongst Allied shipping in the Atlantic due to the Allies' generally poor anti-submarine tactics and large gaps in the air cover. As countermeasures, such as more advanced sonar and depth charges improved, along with the entrance of the United States in the war, U-boat losses began to increase dramatically. Of the 1,150 U-boats constructed during World War II, only 156 would survive until Germany's surrender, and of the few remaining vessels, a further 116 were scuttled by Britain in Operation Deadlight. This left only a handful of surviving U-boats, with many of these being scrapped. Today, only 4 U-boats remain as museum ships, which each having their own unique story, which I highly recommend looking into. It's quite fascinating. And finally, we come to the Mouse tank. The Mouse was a super heavy tank constructed from 1943 to 1944. And the phrase super heavy tank really cannot be overstated enough, as even by German standards, this was indeed a super heavy tank. It weighed in at a colossal 188 tons, or about the same as 6.5 Soviet T-34 tanks. Even today, the Mouse remains the heaviest armored vehicle ever constructed by a considerable margin. The intended purpose of this tank was to spearhead an attack by shrugging off any hits it took due to its immense armor, and it actually proved extremely successful. And well, I'm just kidding, it was a complete failure for obvious reasons. First of all, this tank was about 150 tons too overweight to cross any bridge. Also, this huge weight made it extremely immobile, so if and when it gets stuck, there's not really anything that's going to be able to pull such a heavy tank out, short of another Mouse tank maybe. And being the size of a small house, bombers and aircraft equipped with rockets would have no problem landing hits and taking the Mouse out. Finally, it was just plain stupid for especially late war Germany to devote so many research sources on this project, given their current situation and, of course, their lack of oil, which this tank wasn't the most efficient thing in the world, to say the least. Anyways, 2 Mouse hulls were produced, the V1 and the V2 variants. However, only a single turret was ever completed. This turret was initially used on the V1 hull before being transferred to the V2 hull upon its completion. Neither would ever see any combat, as they were destroyed by the retreating Germans to prevent capture. Despite this, the Soviets were able to mount the turret from the V2 on the V1 hull, as neither were too severely damaged. The combined V1 hull with the V2's turret was returned to the Soviet Union for testing and eventually transferred to the Kubinka Tank Museum, where to this day it currently resides.